Hello, I'm Tom Wilkinson, and welcome to the Thinking in English podcast, a podcast aimed at intermediate to advanced level English learners. On today's episode, we are going to discuss the news that China has landed another probe on the surface of the moon. The Chinese mission intends to collect rock samples to bring back to Earth, the first time this will happen for over 40 years. Why is China interested in space exploration? Are we on the verge of a new space race? What is the scientific importance of moon rocks? We'll look at all of these questions and more on today's episode of Thinking in English. But first, why not follow the Thinking in English Instagram page, Thinking in English Podcast, or the link is in the description. It's full of great vocabulary, pronunciation, and grammar content. And you definitely should look at our blog, thinkinginenglish.blog, for all of our transcripts and bonus content. Link also in the description. Now, here is today's vocabulary list. As always, the written list is in the description of the podcast and also on our blog, thinkinginenglish.blog. Ensuing. Ensuing. Happening after something or because of it. For example, an argument broke out, and in the ensuing fight, someone got hurt. Proxy war. Proxy war. A proxy war is a war fought between groups or smaller countries that each represent the interests of other larger powers and may have help and support from these larger powers. For example, the USA and USSR fought a proxy war in Korea. Capability. Capability. This is the ability to do something. For example, these tasks are beyond my capabilities. Probe. Probe. A probe is a small spacecraft with no one traveling in it, sent into space to make measurements and send back information to scientists on Earth. For example, there is currently a space probe heading towards the sun. To analyze. To analyze. To analyze something is to study or examine it in detail, in order to discover more information about it. For example, researchers analyzed the purchases of 6,300 households. Volcanic. Volcanic. Of or relating to or made by a volcano. They were not expecting the volcanic eruption. Overdrive. Overdrive. This is a state of great activity, effort, or hard work. For example, the cast of the play was in overdrive, rehearsing for the first performance. And finally, lunar. Lunar. Of or relating to the moon. For example, the lunar eclipse was beautiful. In the years following the end of World War II, the competition and ensuing Cold War between the USA and Soviet Union impacted almost every part of international affairs. Although never resulting in a direct conflict between the two superpowers, the Cold War led to years of aggression, proxy wars in Korea and Vietnam, spying, and much more. Incredibly, the Cold War was not limited to the planet Earth. The space race, was a competition taking place from the 1950s until the 1970s between the two Cold War rivals to achieve firsts in space flight capability, to be the first to reach space, to put the first man in space, and to put the first person on the moon. Although the USSR won many of the early races, it was the USA who ultimately is considered to have been victorious in the space race. However, is a new space race about to commence? Emerging superpower China is, at the time of writing at least, in the middle of an operation to place an unmanned probe on the surface of the moon. The robotic Chang'e mission has the aim of collecting samples of rock and dust to bring back to our planet. This would make China only the third country to collect moon rock, and the first country to do so for 44 years. By using a number of specially designed instruments, such as a camera, scoop, and drill, the team of scientists behind the probe hope to gather around 2 kilograms of material. Although nearly 400 kilograms of rock and soil have previously been gathered from the surface of the moon, the majority of this was brought back by the US's Apollo astronauts, who actually landed on the moon in person. The last unmanned probe to gather samples was the Soviet Luna 24 mission, which collected just under 10% of what China aims to do. What is the importance of this mission? Well, I think we can actually ask this question in 2 different ways. What is the scientific importance of this mission? And what is the political importance of this mission? So let's start with the scientific. Analyzing materials from the moon will teach us vital information about the moon's origins, formation, and the volcanic activity on its surface. The Chinese mission has targeted a volcanic area of the moon known as Mons Rumca. Previous moon missions by the USA and Soviet Union have collected samples, but those samples were all very old, perhaps more than 3 billion years old. Samples from Mons Rumca, on the other hand, are likely to be only 1.2 or 1.3 billion years old. Why is this important? Well, the younger rocks will allow scientists to understand the geological history of the moon in more detail. Moreover, these additional insights should allow experts to more accurately predict the ages of the surfaces on other planets. This is done by counting craters. The more craters, the older the surface. But it depends on having some accurate measurements as a guide. What is the political importance of this mission? Well, Chang'e 5's success follows China's 2 previous moon landings, those of Chang'e 3 in 2013 and Chang'e 4 last year. Under President Xi Jinping, plans for China's space dream have gone into overdrive. China is aiming to catch up with the US and Russia in space travel, and perhaps eventually surpass their achievements. The country has invested tremendous amounts of money into its military-run space program, with the ultimate ambition of eventually sending humans to the moon. Last year, China became the first country to land a lunar rover on the far side of the moon. China also has plans for their own space station to be operational in the next few years, an eventual lunar base, and some of the most powerful rockets ever made. Like in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, space travel is undoubtedly a demonstration of power. The technological power to create the advanced devices required, the military power to create enormous rockets, and the national power to coordinate such an event. It is also a source of national pride and inspiration. The USA will always be the first country to put a man on the moon. But who will be the first country to put an astronaut on Mars? So here is today's final thought. China's mission to the moon undoubtedly has scientific and political importance. It will provide scientists with important information about the history and geology of the moon, as well as potentially having consequences for the study of other planets. It also demonstrates China's growing political, military, and scientific power. The last space race was a competition between the USA and Soviet Union. There were no other contestants in the race. What about the next space race, or a future space race? The USA and Russia are still important competitors. And after listening to this podcast, you probably realize that China is also a major rival. India, Japan, Europe, and countries in the Middle East are also actively involved in space exploration. In fact, there are now private companies like SpaceX, Virgin Galactic, and Boeing with the ability to fly to space. This increased competition is likely to push all of the other countries involved to invest and aim at more impressive targets. Perhaps putting another person on the moon, or the first person on Mars, or even a different moon of a different planet in the solar system. What do you think about China's mission to the moon? Do you think it has scientific or political importance? What do you think will happen in the future? Here are today's comprehension questions. As always, the written questions and answers are available in the description of the podcast and also on our blog, thinkinginenglish.blog. How much material does the Chinese probe hope to bring back to Earth? Where on the moon is China planning to land? What private companies are involved in space exploration? Thank you for listening to today's episode of Thinking in English. Please share with your friends, check out our social media links in the description, and send us a message. We really appreciate all of your feedback. If you have any ideas for topics, future podcast guests, or other learning formats, please let us know. And please leave us a rating. We're also now on Instagram. I'm producing daily content focusing on improving your vocabulary, pronunciation, and grammar. So make sure you check out the Thinking in English page. Thinking in English podcast on Instagram, or the link is in the description. Instagram is also probably the best way to contact me. All transcripts of the podcast are now available on the Thinking in English blog. Vocabulary lists, comprehension questions, and articles are all there for you to read. The link is also in the description, so please check it out. Thank you, and see you next time.